my first time in Lima, and I had a lovely drive from Columbus, and loved your beautiful farm landscape. And I guess everything has been harvested, and the land is just quiet, waiting for the winter and for spring to come again. But it's always nice to come to different parts of the country and see the way people live and what the landscape looks like. So I'm very grateful to be here. Now, those of you at the back are welcome to come forward. I don't know how well you could see the screen, but we're just such a small group. I just want to make sure you know that you're welcome to come forward. So this exhibition, this lecture has to do with some of the work I've done for the Allen County Museum, and also having to do with some of the work I did in a couple of exhibitions that Christine mentioned, including the one called Parallel, about the alternative history of women in design. But before starting off on that, I wanted to just say that when I was a young woman, I was loved deeply by my father and my mother, and they told me when I was very small, I got the message that I could do anything I wanted if I put my mind to it. And I believed them. And so when I began to grow up and go to college and I wanted to leave town, my father was really surprised. And he said, why in the world would you want to leave Providence, Rhode Island, which is where I grew up? And I said, because there's a whole world out there and there are things I want to do. And he said, but you're supposed to stay here and get married and have children and make dinner for me on Sunday. And this is a 20th century conversation. I didn't grow up in the 19th century. But I share it just as a measure of knowledge that the world changes, but it doesn't quite change enough, and it's still changing. And the stories we have to tell here in this exhibition and the things I'm going to share with you here are, all part of that growth of women in terms of receiving recognition for their own agency, for the things that they want to do, that they propel themselves to do, and have achieved, as you can see around you. So two touchstones for this little lecture. On the left is Virginia Woolf, and she was the great English writer and poet, and she's famous for a couple of things. One is for a book that's called A Room of One's Own. And there's a famous quotation many of you know, and it's called, a woman must have money and a room of one's own. And I heartily agree. But she also produced another bit of text that was lesser known to me when I started doing this research. And the story is, and she recounts this in 1929, she writes about looking in her library and finding all of these Shakespearean sonnets and such. And she's looking and looking, and she wonders to herself, why is it that there are no women from Shakespeare's era? No names, not a word of that extraordinary literature. When every other man, it seemed, was capable of a song or a sonnet. And so she wrote, indeed, I would venture to guess that Anon, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. And I think she's probably right. Virginia Woolf is one historic touchstone, and the other on the far end is Miriam Shapiro. And Miriam worked in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and she is one of the group of women in that era who began to take on historic techniques like quilting, for instance, and turn them into something else to upset the paradigm of what women were doing to make a quilt for a bed. In this case, this is more of a statement. This is a wall piece. This is a painting. This is art. And so the title of this, and it's actually a collage of many materials. The title of this is Anonymous Was a Woman. So this anonymous story resonates over the decades and continues today. So I just wanted to share a couple of images of works from the exhibition here. And on the left is the kind of sampler that you may have at home yourself. There are a number of wonderful embroideries here. I like this particular one because it shows a young woman, in this case, her name is Mary Conwell Littler, age 12, who created a lace sampler. The date is not entirely clear, but it's one of the oldest pieces given to the society, I believe. But it's a sampler of techniques, of different kinds of embroidery techniques. And she's doing this as an exercise. It's part of that exercise that have engaged women for centuries to improve their knowledge of certain standards, to bring them along so they can be well-prepared young women so that they can do things for their children, in addition to darning socks, but also making beautiful objects. And on the right is an extraordinary piece by Margaret Black, and the photograph here does not do it justice, so I hope you can go over and have a look at it. It's a hair wreath, and hair wreaths were very popular in the 19th century. There was a culture of death that was part of the Victorian world, and the children died young, illness came on unexpectedly, and hair jewelry, you could also find mourning jewelry with hair in it. There's a whole universe of hair-based mementos. But these larger ones are the most complex of all, and typically they do include the hair of family members. And when you look at it, you'll see there are white, there are different shades of brown, and they really do represent this extended family of Margaret Black. And so they have so much knowledge in them. And one wishes, could you go back in time and talk to Margaret? And I wonder what she thought as she was weaving in the hair of certain family members, those she has lost, those who are living even. But that it creates this really living memory of an entire family. So it's really, really special, and I urge you to have a look. So in my essay that you'll see eventually, I talk about this as one of those examples of very high style embroidery. These were produced by a small number of women in the Boston and New England area, and they're known as fishing lady embroideries. And I'll give you a more detailed image, maybe that will help. How's that? Is that a little better? It's slightly faded, but the image is very strong. And women, and we're talking here about elite women. This is a very large piece. This is 45 inches wide. That's a lot of embroidery. It took a very, very long time, and it's a very complicated composition with multiple couples, landscape, trees, houses, hunting dogs, and horses. But the figure I want you to focus on is this one, and it is the central figure known as the fishing lady. And it does show that while women had, for the most part, very little agency of their own, from really the beginning of recorded time, women were involved with the interior sphere of life, the home, the children, and largely because of child rearing, they were kept at the hearth. Whereas men traditionally handled the exterior world, the outside, the building, business dealings. That was the traditional binary arrangement of the nuclear family. The problem was that women going, from the Middle Ages before and onward, they had no property. There was no law protecting them. They really had nothing that they could call their own. In fact, they were kind of like pawns, because especially in these elite families, marriages were economic marriages. They were power matches. So you only had a number of people you could really match with and please the families. However, there was a window. Women could exert their own agency, and it's the fishing lady who represents that. And I would submit that this is a bit of subversive stitchery, because it is a message to other women, and it's out in public, or it's in the house, but it's there for all to see. These objects, which were so wide, these typically went over chimneys. These were chimney pieces or mantel pieces. They often had very elaborate frames. They even had sconces on them. They were regarded in a way as works of art. They were extremely ambitious. And so they were regarded with a great amount of admiration, but they also contained these little messages. And so for those who have eyes to see, the message is, take your time, be restrained. You don't want, a woman doesn't want to look too much in a hurry, but you wait and you do a little fishing, and then you wait for the right mate to come along. And she's seated here. Let's see, is there a business? I can't make that work. Anyway, there's fish here in the basket. I hope you can see. And then here's the fellow. He's got his tri-corner hat in his hand. It looks like a handbag, but it's not. So he's holding that, and he's just sort of leaning over just to say hi, just saying hi. And she is not rushing. She's turning, but she's not rushing to him either. And this is the dance that goes on for a very short period of time in a young woman's life. Once a decision is made, there's really no turning back. So a woman could hold her own for a little while and survey the landscape, and hopefully exert a little bit of control to make a choice of a lifelong mate. And you may ask, why? I mean, I never heard of women fishing in the colonial era. This is like from 1750s or 60s. Well, in fact, angling or recreational fishing was a pursuit of the elite, and there are stories of couples and whole groups of families, 20, 30 people, men and women, enjoying the outdoors. Remember, this is before TikTok and the internet. What are you going to do with yourself? Go outside, enjoy the landscape, do a little angling, have some tea, and maybe meet a gentleman. Maybe you can turn your shoulder to him, or maybe not. So this is a beautiful story where women only had limited opportunities, but that they actually had a great deal of power in this tiny moment to potentially move things in the direction that they wanted. And there's a wonderful article on this subject. If anybody's really interested, I'm happy to share it with Christine, and she can share it with anyone. Here's another example by another one of these young women, and you can see it's the very same posture. And these designs were taught by often ladies who ran little schools for elite women, and that's why they were often copied from one to the other. And the color differences just having to do with the passage of time, whether they were in the sunlight and such. So going on to something much more modern, we have Carrie Russell Poole's wonderful glass objects, and there are examples like this that are in the exhibition. And I'm showing you the whole piece on the right and a detail on the left. And Carrie is a mother, she's an artist, and she's navigating her life as a young mother and trying to figure out, how to do everything that women are expected to do in the 21st century. And it's never an easy thing. Something always suffers, as most of us know. But she too had a way of just making a small dent, making a small point in her work. And so in this case, she tells us that, because this is from 2006, she wasn't very happy with George W. Bush. And I'll leave those details to her, but she wasn't happy with him as a president. So, but what does an image like this have to do with Mr. Bush? Well, it's a quiet act of rebellion. She has the alphabet here, as you can see, but there's one letter that's missing, and that's W. So W is not there, and it's her way of saying, I object quietly, but I object nonetheless. And kind of like the sewing lady images, she's just making her statement in a quiet way, and it's there if you choose to see it. If not, it's just a lovely image of a home. Oh dear, I forgot her name.
Kristen Cliffel.
Kristen Cliffel. It's a hard name to remember. Kristen Cliffel also is in the exhibition, and she also registers the issues around being a mother at home, trying to serve everyone in her own way, and those struggles have come out in her work. So there's this charming piece called The Bride that's on the right. It's a teapot, and she's got her arm out, you know, her one hand is on her hip and the other is extended out, and she looks like the perfect figure of a bride, with the exception that she's covered by a wedding cake, and that's just meant to be that her head is kind of spinning with all these things that are going on. How do you see straight when you can't even see past the wedding cake that's on your head? And so that's a kind of a funny way of looking at the predicament that women face when they're, you know, juggling multiple loads. And on the left is a piece similar to one in the show, and it's called Pretty, Pretty Please. But it's not please as in P-L-E-A-S-E, it's please, P-L-E-A-S. I'm begging you, please. And I've known as a mother, and I've seen mothers try to get people to behave in a certain way, and they are kind and they try, and they don't want to lose their composure, but they're asking. And so this is large. It's 36 by 79, so that's a very big please, but it's still kind of whispering in its own way. And then you have the wonderful work of Janice Lessman-Moss, who recently received a USA Artist Award, a really major vote of confidence for her entire career. Janice is really sort of liberated from all the things that we've been looking at so far, because she's not worried about what anybody thinks. It's not about finding a mate in a complicated colonial world. It's really about the joy of design and her facility with the jacquard loom and the limits of, or the limits of her imagination. So there are just an abundance of marvelous designs to see. They're all made on the jacquard loom, which is a mechanical method that's been used since the, 15th or 16th century. And it also includes a lot of handwork as well. So she's still doing that meditative handwork like they did, with the hair work and with the samplers, but to now these much more artistic ends. So in the show that I worked on, it was a lot of fun to learn about women that had, from far-flung places, whose names were not well known to me or at all. And I'm just showing you just a cross-section of photographs of women from all walks of life and from all parts of the country. And it was a real pleasure to work with the Montreal Museum of Fine Art on that. And I just want to share some of the stories that we were able to tell in that exhibition. And I start with this rather startling image. This is a nude. It's actually taken from a French artist named Ingres, and it's the odalisque, so it's this back side of a very beautiful woman. But as you might notice, she's got the head of a gorilla. And this is produced by a group known as the Guerrilla Girls. They were more like guerrilla as in war, and then a misspelling led them to start wearing these funny masks. But they got together in the 80s to protest the fact that there were so few women whose work was getting into museums. And so this was actually a billboard at one point. And the main question is, do women have to be naked to get into the Met? And that's really a valid question, because in 1985, only 5% of people in the collection at MoMA in New York, 5% were women. That means 95% were men. And 85% of the nudes in that same collection are by men. So, you know, it's the male gaze at women, but women have very little agency of their own. So these women were mad, and they found ways, humorous ways, to get attention. And if you were to Google them, there's lots of very inexpensive things that they produced and that are still circulating. But they drove home a valuable point. This was a little shocking, still is a little shocking, but it got the message through. Why is it that there are so many men and so few women? So fast forward to 2022, and on the left is a look at just the US population. So almost half, or 15.5% of the population in America is female. And of the whole population, 13.6 are African American. And of that group, only 6.6% are Black American women. But if you look at the side on the right, where there are the museum figures, so there are 50% of women in the US, in the whole population. Only 11% are represented in American museums. And there are 13% of African Americans in the US population, only 2% in museums, and so on. For Black American women, it's really, really bleak. 6.6% of the population, but only 0.5% in American museums. So if you read the news, the art news anyway, you do know that there is definitely an effort to balance that out, to just change things just a little bit. And every year, curators do their part in changing that balance, bringing on new people, changing the conversations that museums can have. But it's a very, very slow process. And it's going to take many, many years before we ever come close to parity. But in the meantime, I'm hoping we'll all have a lot of fun helping to shift the conversation. So here's a picture that was famous at the time it came out. These are mid-century male furniture designers, and this photograph appeared in Playboy magazine in 1961. And these are the big major American designers: George Nelson, Ed Wormley, Eero Saarinen, who did the big arch in St. Louis, Harry Bertoy, Charles Eames, and Jens Rissam. And each one, you know, they're looking very dapper in their suits, and they're all sitting or standing by an object that they designed. Well, that's all well and good, but what it doesn't show you are the women who worked with them. And so just for two examples, on the left, Lucia de Respinis, who is now in her 90s, she worked for George Nelson, and she had a long career designing for him, and her name was never known at the time. It was always under the George Nelson name. And on the right, this fellow here, this is Charles Eames, and this is his wife, Ray Eames. And Ray and Charles were a designing couple. They met at Cranbrook, and they had a very long and fruitful career together. But in all the years, until really through their entire married life, it was always Charles who got top billing. And in fact, more than that, he was often the only person. And she was behind the curtain. And we'll come back to that a little later. So, but now just to pull back a little bit, women have been making objects for the home for time immemorial, and they always did. And those who achieved high levels of creation, they became better known. And in the 19th century, with colonial Americans, with European Americans having colonized the West, Native Americans' work was becoming very interesting to them. As the West was beginning to fade, as the frontier was retreating, there was a sense of the noble savage who was now fading into the distance, and there was a heightened interest in Native American handcraft, which for us today is very fortunate because these unusual and remarkable pieces have come down to us. So on the left, this woman here who has this pointy cap is Marianne Christian Paul, and she was a Micmac artist. She was in the Canadian area, and she was working she worked with porcupine quills, which was a very particular kind of work made by the Micmac. They often made small boxes and things like that. But this is a quite large cradle with a very complex design and images on it. And it won awards at the time, and it was actually purchased, if I recall correctly, by the fellow who ran the trading post that she knew. So that's how it got preserved. And then on the right, this is a tea cozy. So it's not a hat, it's a tea cozy. And it's made with this kind of overlay, kind of applique work that they did with additional stitches with horsehair and cotton thread. And what's interesting about both of these things is that the cradle and the tea cozy they're not actually native objects. They are made for Western use. That's not that baby Native American babies were in these cradle boards that were carried by their mothers. This was for a westernized baby. So they were working within the constraints they had. They applied their technique as best they knew how, and they made these beautiful objects that were treasured and have come down to us. But in one case we know Mary Christian Paul because she won awards. There's a photograph of her. She achieved a measure of fame in her own time. But this marvelous little tea cozy on the right is an extraordinary little work of art. And we have no idea what her name was. We have no idea what she thought when she made this or who she had in mind when she made it for. And sometimes we use the word anonymous, sometimes we say unknown maker. And lately I've seen museums say maker not yet identified, which signifies that there's a search, there's a hope that maybe with a little more research we will know more. So on one side of the pond, there were Native Americans, and there were these people doing samplers that we heard about. On the other side, there was this emerging arts and crafts movement. And one of the major figures in the arts and crafts movement was William Morris. And William Morris was a major figure. He produced printed books. He dyed his own yarn. He created tapestries, and a whole industry kind of grew up around him. And he had a daughter, and her name was May. And May appeared with him everywhere. She was his helpmeet, and so in so very many ways. But it's only, I think, in maybe 2020 that May actually received her first exhibition. And so the extent of her own contributions to design were finally known. On one side, we have a necklace that's now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's actually, it's called a girdle, so it was more of a belt. Pardon me, but it reminds me of a necklace, sorry. And then on the left is actually an illustration from one of the small books a book cover that she embroidered. And it has very small seeds, pearl seeds that have also been added amongst other things. So while William Morris is kind of a titan, and his name extends today, you can buy William Morris wallpaper, you can buy William Morris textiles. May Morris is only now, there's a light is now shining on her and her own significant contributions. At Tiffany & Company, women finally got their due about 10 years ago. The story is that Louis Comfort Tiffany, son of the founder of the jewelry store, he had expanded into glass. So they were making stained glass windows, and they were making table lamps and such. And in order to do the work of finally making the color selections and dealing with these tiny pieces of cut glass that the men were cutting, the women were being engaged to actually assemble the lamps in their color arrangements. And that was because Mr. Tiffany said, these women are much better at it than the guys. Well, the men were very angry about that, and there was a bit of a power struggle. But thanks to Mr. Tiffany, that was settled. But even more than that, what was discovered, there are actually 2 sets of diaries that Clara Driscoll had produced. This is the woman you see here. She had been writing to her sisters in this kind of round-robin kind of way. So it would go from one family member and mail to another, and people would add their notes onto it. They were discovered at almost the same time, and lo and behold, all this information came out that proved that Clara Driscoll was actually designing many of these lamps, and she was in charge of the women. And not only that, she was in charge of this man, and this is Joseph Briggs. And there's a little quotation here that I'll share with you, and this is in one of these round-robin letters that she wrote to her sisters. I thought it would be nice for you to have a picture of me at work in my apron and sleeves, with my head workman in attendance. It is exactly the way we look every day. So very prosaic and yet so profound to realize that here she is in a position of responsibility. And even in her time, the same similar problems held. For instance, if you were a single woman, you could work for Mr. Tiffany. The minute you got married, you had to stay home. That was just the way it was. So Clara was a single woman. She worked for Mr. Tiffany, and then she got married, and she left. And for reasons that I'm not entirely clear on, she married twice, and in both cases, it didn't stick. So Mr. Tiffany liked her and appreciated her, so she always came back. And so at least in this case, here's somebody who, she went to art school. Most of the women that worked with her, the ones we know of, they did actually attend various kinds of art classes, and so they were able to put that education to work. And this was one of the great liberating moments in what is, late aesthetic, early arts and crafts period. There are classes being offered, and women for the first time are really able to attend without having a companion with them. Women could go together, women could go alone. It was considered acceptable behavior for a woman to attend these classes, and it was acceptable to work in the arts. So women are finally being liberated from the home and able to make a living, which was something that had been really denied to them. And the 20th Amendment, the voting amendment, didn't pass until 1920, and even that did not extend to Hispanics, blacks, Asians, or indigenous Americans. So women were just making their progress as they could, and really making important contributions. So this particular lamp design, the Peacock, which is one of the most popular of its type, was definitely designed by Clara Driscoll. And so now next time you see one, you can smile to yourself and say, I know who made that. Women were also very involved in the world of ceramics, and some of you may be familiar with Maria Longworth Nichols, who was the founder of Rookwood Pottery. She lived in Cincinnati. She was very well-to-do, and at the time that she was sort of coming of age in the 1870s, she was becoming very curious about china painting, and that was a term that was used when you paint the surface of a porcelain blank. So she wasn't making the pots, she was decorating them. And china painting as a concept became all the rage, and she began to perfect different ways of creating these glazes. This is one of her celebrated vases, which looks like there's a kind of a net that's capturing the carp that are inside, very Japanese kind of a concept. She had been very influenced by Japanese publications. She went to the 1876 fair and saw a Japanese exhibit. So she had an enormous effect, and as a model to other women, she was enormously successful. On a more modest scale, many, many women decided that they could do this for themselves. You didn't need a lot of materials. All you needed was to buy pigments. You had to buy the blanks. You could come up with your own design, and they could be fired pretty easily locally. And so women all over the country began to do this, and you probably have one or two in your cabinet, don't even know it, but a lot of these women did sign them on the back, proof that they were very proud of what they did. And a little bit like Sarah Driscoll and her Tiffany girls, you could make a little money if you did these well and sold them. So this example was signed by a young woman named Marie Bowman, and she worked on a French blank, porcelain blank, and this is actually now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So there has been a renewed assessment of these works and the value of them, and as an evidence of women's agency in trying to assert themselves as artists and potentially as people who could sell their art and make a living at it. And one of the examples of such a person is my favorite lady, Henrietta Paste. Henrietta lived in Minneapolis, and she studied watercolor, she studied China painting, and she went to Europe. She came back, and she was all fired up about putting out her sign. And this, I know it's very pale, but it is actually a sign that says, Henrietta Barclay Paste, designer of watercolor studies for the China decorator. And the photograph on the left shows her in her artistic studio with bits of netting. There's a Chinese umbrella and fans, and there she is working away at her projects. So she was extremely proud of her accomplishments. She actually contributed designs to one of these ceramic magazines that people study, and unusually for her, she married and she continued to work. So she obviously had a husband who understood her need to continue to be creative. But once you get into the arts and crafts movement and people are attending school, they're making objects, this is the moment where women really began to step up and experience a whole new sense of empowerment. And in Massachusetts, in the western suburb of Deerfield, which was an early colonial site, it was actually a great massacre in Deerfield. They had a strong sense of their colonial history. Several women founded the Deerfield Blue and White Society, and they copied colonial designs in blue and white embroidery, which was all well and good, but then they got more interested in creating their own designs. And this is where you find this lovely piece on the left, which shows 4 dragonflies circling around a pool of water with little leaves circling at the center. Very Japanesque in design, and a real markedly major step for them away from that traditional colonial work towards something new and modern. And Native Americans who were able to obtain some art education also achieved a measure of success. Angel de Cora Dietz, who is a Winnebago, she became the designer for this book that's called the Indian Book, and it is a book of Native American music. And fortunately, she was engaged to produce the book design, and the design with these sort of diamond-shaped forms are actually based upon a Native American packet that's called a parfleche. And so she abstracted that, added it to this book design, and helped to convey Native American values and colors to Americans around the country. Now, many of us here have heard the name of Maria Martinez. She was a Native American artist from Santa Clara. She was one of the first people who really made it, in the sense of becoming a national darling as a maker of Native American pots. She had appeared at many of the important international expositions in Chicago, in San Francisco, and she had a husband who also helped her, but she was the one who was able to garner the most interest, and that's why that is not entirely clear. But you can see her here with her husband. She's right here at the center, and her husband is painting the decoration on the bowl like the one you see here. And what scholars are now saying about Maria, she's got to be the most commonly known Native American or Indigenous American potter in America. But she taught her family members to make the pots. She actually got a kind of an industrial level program going at the village level, let's be clear. But she understood her value, and she began to charge more for them. And when she was asked why did she always use black, she started using black because of something that had been found, and they were looking at it, an ancient shard that had been discovered. But she said, tourists like black. It was a design choice, by the tourists. And rather than think, well, tourism makes it less valuable in some way, instead she's turning it back on the consumer, saying if that's what they want, I'm going to give it to them, and I'm going to make it more valuable, more useful to me. And that's how her career actually expanded. So it's a kind of, the way you think about these things is what makes all the difference. Something that I had never heard of before this exhibition in Montreal was this jingle dress. Has anybody heard of these before? You have, okay, I'm glad somebody did. Jingle dresses have a sort of a foggy origin. It's thought that an Indigenous man, his daughter was very sick, and he didn't know what to do to help her. But he had a dream, and in the dream, he was told to make these dresses and to have them worn, and then they would dance. And he dreamt what the dances were to be. He woke up, he told his wife, got to do it, we have to do this, and they did. And now, today, there are probably a dozen or maybe more of these dresses that have survived. And what they have is they have this jingle. They used to take old tobacco tins and take the metal and curl them a little bit. And then when they're hanging together, they all jingle against one another. And they also have beads. Lots of times they use these Czech Bohemian glass beads that were imported and given to Native Americans to use. And so you see those. But also, especially with the one on the left, I find, the women who were making these, and this one is said to date to the 20s, these women were looking at Western magazines. They were looking at Harper's Bazaar or whatever, because this dress has a dropped waist and is a really up-tempo, sort of, modern take on Native American garments. And so it's an interesting sort of mixture of the old and the new. And I found this wonderful historic photograph of two women wearing them. And of course, these were done for show, for advertising. It's not always clear what the purpose was. One of them was actually smoking a long pipe, and the other one is just posing next to her. But these became a very important form of expression in their own right. The Metropolitan had a show recently with two of these on view, which was quite a sight. And of course, ornamental dress among indigenous tribal groups continues at a furious rate. I mean, today you go to these gatherings and it's a fashion show of Native American regalia. In the 20s and 30s, more and more African American women were having a certain amount of influence in their own way. It wasn't always very great, to different degrees, but there are discoveries that help to alter our understanding of success for them. And the one on the left, turned out to be quite an interesting one. In Philadelphia, there was a woman by the name of Anna Russell Jones, and she went to school in Philadelphia. She studied art education and design, and when she came out, she was working as a rug designer. So what you see here is one of many, many, many designs that she produced, and she worked with local rug makers so that to see her designs put into production. So she was somebody who actually was entering what we would call today, the interior design industry. I mean, people go to school today to do those things, but she somehow found a wedge in and found a measure of success. And then on the right, Lois Mayu Jones was a very celebrated American painter, but until her paintings caught on, she found engagement as a designer of wallpaper. So this work on the right, which is called Afro Idol, has these idol figures and animals and palm trees in very bright colors. And this was one of a number of wallpaper designs that she produced. And this was a way to pay the rent, keep on working, make more contacts, keep moving forward. That's always the name of the game. But for these two women, it was especially unusual and extraordinary for them to get so far. And in the 30s, as men had gone off to war, when they had to go off during World War I, women began to step into their roles. And by the 30s, 20s and 30s, more and more women were getting into the design world, and they were enjoying themselves, making a living. Some of them less well known than others, as we've already discussed. Like on the right, Elsa Tenhart produced these very geometric and lively designs. This is the cocktail set that you see on the right. And the stamps actually look like they're dancing because they have these angles. Elsa Tenhart was not known to anybody until somebody stumbled across a design and a copyright signature. So she is still kind of an enigma to us. We have a name, we have a little else. But on the left side, we have the work of Belle Kogan. And Belle was a Philadelphia girl. She grew up in her father's jewelry store, but she loved to design, and she got 2 or 3 breaks, and she parlayed that into an international design business that she carried through to the 1970s when she retired. And she worked in metal, she worked in clay, she designed furniture, aluminum, all kinds of industrial arts. So how are we doing on time?
We're near the end.
We're near the end. Okay. I'm going to fast forward a little bit because I think I have too many slides.
No, you don't.
That's not here. All right. So here's Miriam Shapiro, who I mentioned earlier. Anonymous was a woman. And here's the full scale of her piece, but the detail is what is easier to focus on. But she took all kinds of materials, collage, textiles, found and newly made. I think a big part of this central piece is actually something that she discovered. Grandmother's tatting and such. Whatever it was, she just turned it into her own piece. And what she introduced here is not only the fact that it's a woman who made it and she's acknowledging that women don't get respect, but she's also taking the time to show to people that these are the hand arts, these are the needle arts, these are women's arts, and there's nothing wrong with them being on a wall in a museum as a work of art. And furthermore, she was also introducing something new in the fine arts, which seems funny today, but at the time she was making these in the 70s, in those days, every painting that was coming out was abstract. Abstraction, 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 to the point of artists actually making paintings that were totally black. And I'm not kidding, black on black. And it was really women, there was a movement of a group of people, but mostly women, who began to reintroduce pattern and decoration. And they're called the pattern and decoration movement. And they were the ones who finally pulled everybody back from this brink of annihilation, of abstraction. Because how far can you go? You can't go any further. But she brought this back, and a number of other women in her cohort helped to do that. And as we know today, everybody loves pattern. Paintings have lots of pattern, and there's no problem with it. But the fine art people of the day had deemed decoration as kitsch, and kitsch did not belong in an art museum, and that was bad and low and poor and women's work. And her job was to turn that upside down, and she achieved it. And I'll just show these last two, and I think we can conclude with these. One of the women she also showed with was Faith Ringgold, and Faith was a woman of color. She died, I think, last year. Mm-hmm. And Faith was one of those women, like the Guerrilla Girls, who was really angry with the fact that it was so hard to get women's work into the Met, into the Whitney, into MoMA. And, but she persevered and persevered. And she ended up producing a large series of quilts that she painted. And so it was kind of a mixture of the quilting work that was women's work and painting that was the big male thing to paint. And she achieved a great, I mean, she's now really in the firmament of modern artists. But to look at this, you can see her origins and the joy she found growing up in Harlem. This is called Tar Beach. Tar Beach refers to rooftops in New York City. That's the beach you have when you can't get to the beach, you have the roof. And she's showing her parents in this triangle. It's her parents having dinner, and she's lying down with her brother looking up at the stars. And the Brooklyn Bridge is on the left, and her father worked on the Brooklyn Bridge. So she is telling this transporting story, watching the angels fly around, the bridge is twinkling, and life is really, really, really beautiful. And I'll finish with this final piece by Carolyn Meslumi, who is an Ohio artist. Anybody know Carolyn? She's become very famous. She started out as an astrophysicist, and I'm sure she still works in that capacity, but she began to advocate for Black women as quilters. And she formed a national organization of them. And she herself is a quilter, and this is hers. And this is Billie Holiday, the jazz singer, and so it's called The Lady Sings the Blues. But Carolyn has become an advisor on a number of textile exhibitions around the country, and the Smithsonian has acquired pieces of hers, and she's become an advisor for a whole new generation of curators who are now adding to their collection, changing the story of women and quilts and handwork, and improving our view of what a woman can do.
Mm.